The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, hung heavy over the Pacific as Vice Admiral Keiichi Magumo peered through his binoculars from the bridge of the aircraft carrier Kagi. The same man who had orchestrated the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now commanded the most powerful naval strike force the world had ever seen. For massive aircraft carriers, Kagi Kaga Soryu, and Hiracut through the swells toward a tiny coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of. Midway launched the first wave, Nagumo commanded, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Within minutes, the flight decks erupted in controlled chaos as 108 aircraft roared into the morning sky. Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and sleek Mitsubishi Zero fighters formed up in perfect V formations, their rising sun insignia gleaming in the early light. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led this aerial armada toward Midway, knowing that success here would open the door to Hawaii itself. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was audacious in its scope. Midway would serve as bait to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and experience would crush the enemy once and for all. As reported in contemporary naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, the Japanese force approaching Midway represented the pinnacle of naval aviation power, with over 260 aircraft carried aboard their 4 fleet carriers. The Americans, by contrast, could muster barely half that number from their hastily assembled task forces. On Midway itself, the radar operators stared at their glowing screens in disbelief. Incoming aircraft, dozens of them, approaching from the northwest at high speed, the klaxons wailed across the tiny island as Marines grabbed their rifles and pilots sprinted toward their aircraft. Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, barked orders as his men rushed to their battle stations. "This is it, boys," Shannon shouted over the rising din. "Everything we've trained for comes down to the next few hours." The defenders of Midway knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. But they also knew something the Japanese didn't, thanks to brilliant codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly when and where the attack would come. 3 American aircraft carriers, Hornet, the hastily repaired Yorktown, lay in wait northeast of the atoll, their presence unknown to the approaching Japanese fleet. As Tominaga's bombers descended upon Midway's installations, anti-aircraft guns opened up with thunderous fury. The sky filled with deadly black puffs of flak as American fighters rose to meet the attackers. The battle for Midway had begun, but neither side yet realized that the fate of the Pacific War itself hung in the balance. Above these remote coral sands, the first bombs fell at 6:27 that morning, and with them, the course of history began to pivot. The earth shook beneath Midway as Japanese bombs found their marks. Fuel tanks erupted in towering columns of flame, sending black smoke billowing across the atoll. The powerhouse that generated electricity for the island's vital radar installations took a direct hit, plunging sections of the base into darkness. Yet for every building destroyed, for every crater blown in the runways, the defenders fought back with surprising tenacity. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, rose to meet the enemy. Despite being hopelessly outclassed by the nimble Zeros, Major Floyd Parks led his pilots into the teeth of the Japanese formation, knowing full well that many would not return. The sky above Midway became a deadly ballet of twisting, diving aircraft trailing smoke and flame. Tally-ho, and it's at 2 o'clock high. Parks radioed as he dove toward a formation of Val dive bombers. His guns chattered, sending tracers streaking toward the enemy aircraft. One bomber staggered, its engines smoking, before plummeting into the Pacific below. But the Marines paid dearly for their courage. Within minutes, 13 of the 25 American fighters had been shot down there, pilots either dead or floating in life rafts among the shark-infested waters. The Japanese air superiority seemed absolute, just as Nagumo had planned. As the first wave of attackers returned to their carriers, Lieutenant Commander Tominaga radioed a message that would change everything. There is need for a second attack. The initial strike had damaged Midway's facilities but failed to neutralize them completely. Anti-aircraft guns still barked defiance, and the runways, though cratered, remained partially operational. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo faced the first critical decision of the day. His bombers returning from Midway were running low on fuel and needed immediate recovery. Meanwhile, his second-wave aircraft sat on the hangar decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for use against American ships, if any should appear. The admiral's staff urged him to rearm these aircraft with high-explosive bombs suitable for another land attack. "Commence rearming operations," Nagumo ordered, not knowing that this decision would seal his fate. As Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching bomb loads, precious time ticked away. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were wheeled away from aircraft and stacked haphazardly on hangar decks. While high-explosive bombs were brought up from the magazines, historical records from the Naval War College indicate that this rearming process typically took at least an hour and a half, during which the carriers were extremely vulnerable. The Japanese crews worked with practiced efficiency, but they could not work fast enough to outrun destiny. Unknown to Nagumo, American scout planes from the cruiser USS Historia had spotted his fleet at 7:28 that morning. The radioed message: enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees. Distance 180 miles. Electrified the American task force commanders. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown and Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding. Enterprise and Hornet now knew exactly where to strike. Launch the attack. Fletcher signaled across the waves. Within minutes, the American carriers erupted in their own controlled frenzy as every available aircraft was pushed toward the flight decks. Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, Grumman Avenger, torpedo bombers, and Wildcat fighters roared into the sky, their destination clear: find and destroy the Japanese carriers before they could launch another devastating strike. The hunters had become the hunted, but neither side yet realized how quickly the tables had the morning sun climbed higher as 42 American torpedo bombers from 3 different squadrons began their desperate race against time. Leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier, Hornet Lieutenant Commander John Waldron banked his Douglas Devastator toward the Japanese fleet. Knowing he was flying into almost certain death, "We'll go in on the deck," Waldron radioed to his 14 pilots, his voice calm despite the magnitude of their mission. The Devastator was already obsolete, slow and ungainly compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros that would soon swarm around them like angry wasps. But these were the only torpedo bombers available. Someone had to slow down the enemy carriers. The tactical situation favored the Japanese overwhelmingly. Their carriers sailed in a tight box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Above them, a combat air patrol of deadly Zero fighters circled like hungry sharks, ready to pounce on any approaching threat. The Americans would have to penetrate this defensive screen, survive the concentrated fire of dozens of warships, somehow get close enough to drop their torpedoes. According to wartime records preserved at the National Archives, Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet without fighter escort, having become separated from their protective Wildcats during the long flight across the Pacific. They were alone, flying straight into the heart of enemy power. "Attack immediately," Waldron ordered as the Japanese fleet came into sight. His Devastators dropped to wave-top heights, skimming across the white-capped swells at barely 150 miles per hour. Almost immediately, the sky filled with Zeros, diving down like hawks on field mice. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itiya, leading the Japanese fighter patrol, spotted the approaching torpedo bombers and felt a surge of confidence. These lumbering American aircraft would be easy prey for his nimble Zeros. "Banzai," he called over the radio as he rolled into his attack dive. The slaughter was methodical and terrible. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down, their crews either dying instantly or plunging into the Pacific in flames. Waldron's own aircraft was hit repeatedly, hydraulic fluid and oil streaming from punctured lines, but he pressed on until a burst of cannon fire finally sent him spinning. into the sea. Within 10 minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage and watching the battle unfold around him. He would later provide crucial eyewitness testimony about what happened next. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise met the same fate. 10 of their 14 aircraft shot down. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown fared little better, losing 10 of 12 bombers. In less than 20 minutes, the cream of American naval aviation had been virtually annihilated. Not a single torpedo found its target. On the bridges of the Japanese carriers, officers cheered as they watched the American planes falling like autumn leaves. Admiral Nagumo nodded with satisfaction, believing the enemy's main attack had been defeated. His carriers were still intact, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for the decisive counterstroke. "The Americans are not as formidable as we thought," one staff officer commented. But their celebration would be short-lived. High above the scattered wreckage of the torpedo squadrons, invisible against the bright morning sky, something else was approaching, something that would change the course of the war in the span of 6 devastating minutes. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. They had drawn every Japanese fighter down to sea level, leaving the sky above wide open for the real killing blow that was. It's already beginning its deadly descent. At 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered down through his cockpit windscreen and spotted the white wakes of the Japanese fleet spread across the deep blue Pacific, leading 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise. McCluskey had been searching for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low. Now finally he had found his prey. "Attack! Attack!" McCluskey radioed, pushing his aircraft into a steep dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, his pilots followed in perfect formation, their 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs slung beneath their bellies like deadly eggs waiting to hatch. The Japanese had made a fatal error. Every Zero fighter in their combat air patrol was down at sea level. Having just finished slaughtering the American torpedo squadrons, the sky above the carriers was completely undefended, leaving them naked against the diving hawks that now plummeted from 12,000 feet. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was in the midst of making another critical decision. His first wave aircraft had returned from Midway and were being refueled and rearmed on the hangar decks. Aviation gasoline lines snaked across the flight deck, while bombs and torpedoes sat stacked in neat piles waiting to be loaded. The carriers were floating ammunition dumps, vulnerable to the slightest spark. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey selected the Kaga as his primary target, rolling his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive. The carrier grew larger and larger in his bomb sight as he plummeted earthward, the wind screaming past his canopy. At 1,500 feet, he released his bomb and pulled out of the dive so sharply that his vision grayed from the G-forces. The bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the stern, penetrating to the hangar deck below where it detonated among stacked aviation ordnance. The explosion was catastrophic, setting off a chain reaction that turned the carrier into a blazing inferno within minutes. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as ammunition cooked off, sending flames and debris high into the sky. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best led 3 more Dauntlesses against the flagship Akagi. His bomb hit just behind the amidships elevator, blasting a gaping hole in the flight deck and starting fires that quickly spread to the fueled aircraft below. Within minutes, Akagi was also burning out of control, her proud battle flag wilting in the heat of her own funeral pyre, as documented in official U.S. Navy battle reports. The 3rd Japanese carrier, Soryu, met the same fate when 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, scored multiple direct hits. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a sea of flame and twisted metal. In the span of just 6 minutes from 10:22 to 10:28, of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks, their decks blown apart, their crews fighting desperately to contain fires that threatened to consume the entire ships. the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Kido. Butai was being gutted by American bombs dropped with surgical precision. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stared in shock at the flames consuming his flagship. The heat was becoming unbearable, and reports flooded in of similar damage to Kaga and Soryu. In minutes, his overwhelming advantage had evaporated like morning mist. "Transfer the flag to the cruiser Nagara," Nagumo ordered, his voice hollow with disbelief. As he prepared to abandon his burning flagship, he knew that the course of the Pacific War had just shifted irrevocably. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and Japan's momentum was bleeding away with every second that passed. But the battle was far from over. One Japanese carrier remained. Her captain was already planning a counterstroke that would test American resolve to its very limits. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier, Hiryu, the sole survivor of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty Kido Butai. Around him, 3 sister ships burned like funeral pyres on the horizon, their smoke columns rising into the afternoon sky like black monuments to Japanese hubris. But Kaku was not a man to surrender while he still had aircraft and ammunition. "All available planes to flight stations," Kaku commanded. Despite the devastating American attack, Hiryu had escaped unscathed, hidden by a rain squall during the crucial 6 minutes that had doomed her sisters. Now she would strike back with whatever strength remained. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Valdive bombers off Hiryu's deck at 10:58, followed by 60 fighters under Lieutenant Shigeru Mori. Their target, the American carrier Yorktown, which Japanese scouts had spotted 90 miles to the southeast. If they could sink even one enemy flat top, some measure of honor might be salvaged from this disaster. Aboard Yorktown, radar operators watched the approaching enemy formation with growing tension. Bogies bearing 270, distance 30 miles and closing fast, the talker announced over the ship's communication system. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered general quarters, and within minutes, the carrier's Wildcat fighters were climbing to intercept. The Yorktown had been hastily repaired after damage sustained in the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier. Dry dock repairs that should have taken 90 days had been completed in an impossible 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, with civilian workers literally welding steel plates while the ship got underway for Midway. How she would face the supreme test of both her repairs and her crew's mettle, as documented in official Navy Department communications. The American fighter pilots fought with desperate courage against Kobayashi's attack force. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighter patrol, employed his innovative thatch weave formation to maximize their effectiveness against the superior American and Japanese fighters twisted through the sky in deadly aerial ballet, trading altitude for advantage in a contest where the slightest mistake meant death, despite the fierce resistance. Several Japanese dive bombers broke through the defensive screen. Kobayashi himself led the attack, pushing his Val into a steep dive toward Yorktown's flight deck. American anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly bursts of flak, but the Japanese pilot pressed on with samurai determination. Bombs away, Kobayashi called as he released his payload and pulled out of his dive. His bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck near the number 2 elevator, punching through the steel plating and exploding deep within the ship.
Ow!
2 more bombs followed in quick succession, one penetrating to the 4th deck and another starting fires among the aircraft parked on the hangar deck. Yorktown shuddered under the impacts, her forward momentum slowing as damage control parties rushed to contain the fires. Smoke poured from her wounds, and she began to list slightly to port. But her crew, trained to fight their ship until the bitter end, refused to give up. Within an hour, they had patched the flight deck sufficiently to resume air operations. "We're still in the fight," Captain Buckmaster announced over the ship's public address system. His words proved prophetic when 10 aircraft managed to land aboard the patched deck, proving that American determination could match Japanese courage blow for blow. But Captain Kaku was not finished, even as his first strike force limped back to Hiryu. He was preparing a second attack. This time, he would send every remaining aircraft in a final, desperate gambit to even the odds. Torpedo Squadron 2. Led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway, prepared for what they all knew might be their final mission. The stage was set for the last act of this dramatic day, where individual heroism would determine whether Japan's rising sun would set forever over the Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga wrapped a white hachimaki headband around his flight helmet as his Kate torpedo bomber sat spotted on Harry's flight deck. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he prepared to lead what remained of the carrier's attack force against the wounded American flat top. His fuel tank had been holed by anti-aircraft fire during the morning strike on Midway, making this a one-way mission, but Tominaga showed no hesitation. For the Emperor and the glory of Japan, he called to his fellow pilots as 10 torpedo bombers and 6 escorting Zeros roared off Hiryu's deck at 1:28 in the afternoon. He climbed steadily toward the southeast where smoke still rose from the damaged Yorktown like a beacon, guiding them to their target. Aboard the American carrier, repair crews worked frantically to patch the holes blown in her flight deck. Welders showered sparks onto steel plates while damage control parties fought the fires still burning deep within the ship. Captain Buckmaster had managed to get his vessel back up to 20 knots, and her radar was functioning well enough to detect the approaching Japanese strike. "Here they come again," reported the fighter direction officer. 18 bogies, bearing 285, altitude 8,000, distance 40 miles. Once more, Yorktown's remaining Wildcats climbed to meet the threat, their pilots grim-faced but determined. The air battle that followed was a masterpiece of tactical aviation, with both sides displaying the skill and courage that marked the elite naval aviators of their respective nations. Lieutenant Commander Thatch led his fighters in coordinated attacks against the Japanese formation, while Zero pilots twisted and turned with acrobatic grace to protect their vulnerable torpedo bombers, but numbers and determination told in the end. Despite losing several aircraft to the American fighters, Tominaga's torpedo bombers pressed home their attack with samurai spirit. Skimming just above the wave tops, they approached Yorktown from multiple angles, forcing her anti-aircraft gunners to divide their fire, as recorded in contemporary U.S. Navy after-action reports. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, flooding her forward engine room and causing a severe list that stopped flight operations entirely. The carrier began to settle by the bow as seawater rushed through the gaping holes in her hull. This time, even American ingenuity couldn't patch the damage quickly enough. Captain Buckmaster gave the heartbreaking order to abandon ship at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, watching his crew file over the side with quiet dignity. Many of these same men had fought to save their ship twice in one day, first from bomb damage and now from torpedo strikes. Yet even as they lowered lifeboats and activated life rafts, they remained proud of their service and defiant in defeat. Tominaga never saw his torpedoes strike home. His damaged bomber had finally run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific minutes before the attack, taking with it one of Japan's most experienced and capable naval aviators. His sacrifice, like that of so many others on both sides, would be measured not in individual glory, but in its contribution to the larger tide of war. But even as Yorktown lay mortally wounded, American revenge was already forming up on the flight decks of Enterprise. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the hero of the morning's devastating attack on the Japanese carriers, was preparing to lead one final strike against the only remaining enemy flat top. Hiryu had revealed her position by launching her attacks, and now she would pay the price for her boldness. 20-4 Dauntless dive bombers rose from Enterprise's deck at 3:30, pilots hungry for vengeance against the ship that had mortally wounded their sister carrier. The wheel of fortune, which had turned so dramatically against the Japanese that morning, was about to complete another devastating revolution. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his revenge strike toward the last Japanese carrier. Far below, Hiryu steamed alone through waters littered with debris from her 3 sister ships, her deck crews frantically preparing what few aircraft remained for another sortie. Captain Tomio Kaku knew his position was hopeless, but like a true samurai, he would fight until the bitter end. "There she is," McCluskey radioed at 5 o'clock as Hiryu came into view. Her flight deck crowded with aircraft spotted for launch. The irony was almost perfect. The same American pilot who had delivered the morning's knockout blow would now administer the coup de grace to Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu's bridge, watched the approaching dive bombers with fatalistic calm. One of the most brilliant tacticians in the Imperial Navy, he had foreseen this moment from the instant his lookouts reported the destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Japan's carefully planned operation to destroy American naval power had become, instead, a funeral pyre for her own maritime supremacy. The dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet in near vertical dives, their 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs aimed at Hiryu's vitals. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator, blasting a crater in the flight deck and igniting AFGS fires among the spotted aircraft. 3 more bombs followed in rapid succession, each one tearing deeper into the carrier's bowels. Within minutes, Hiryu was transformed from a proud warship into a blazing wreck. Her hangar deck became an inferno as aviation gasoline fed fires that reached temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Secondary explosions shook the ship as ammunition cooked off, sending fragments of metal and burning debris high into the air, as recorded in Japanese naval archives later captured by Allied forces. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of defeat. At 2:30 in the morning of June 5th, he and Captain Kaku stood together on Hiryu's bridge as their carrier slipped beneath the waves. Both men had removed their caps and were singing the Japanese national anthem as the Pacific closed over their heads. The Battle of Midway was over, and with it died Japan's hopes of victory in the Pacific War. In the space of 24 hours, the Imperial Navy had lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, over 250 aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots and air crew. The carefully trained elite that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor was gone forever. American losses, while painful, were far more sustainable. Yorktown was the only carrier lost, along with 1 destroyer and 147 aircraft. More importantly, most of the American aircrews were rescued from the water and would fight again. Japan's losses in trained personnel could never be replaced. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, received the news with quiet satisfaction.
The code breakers who had made victory possible.
The pilots who had pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds, and the countless support personnel who had made the operation possible, had achieved something unprecedented. They had stopped the Japanese advance cold and begun the long decide march toward Tokyo Bay. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, it marked not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power. The tide had turned decisively, and the momentum that had carried Japan from Pearl Harbor to the gates of Australia was broken forever. The rising sun would continue to fight with characteristic courage and determination, and never again would it shine with the absolute confidence of those early days. Midway had fought back with fury, and in doing so, had changed the course of history itself. The small coral atoll, barely visible on most maps, become the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation and the birthplace of American victory in the Pacific War.